Hello, sports fans. Another edition of Mr. V Talks Government is coming at you here. We're going to talk about the amendments today, 1 through 27. Now, if you're in Ficker's class, you've already kind of started working on this. If you're in my class, this is the week that we are going to start working on the amendments, and you will have an assignment associated with this presentation. So I'll try and make this as quick and as harmless as I possibly can. But we are going to go through the amendments, numbers 1 through 27 today. Starting off with the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. They came along right at the beginning of our constitutional republic. So as soon as we ratified the Constitution and it became the law of the land, by 1789, when all 13 of the original states had ratified the document, they realized that there were some problems. They realized that the Anti-Federalists had made some pretty decent points. The main thing that the Anti-Federalists had brought up, people like George Mason, people like Patrick Henry, the main thing that they had brought up is an absence of a list of rights within the document. That they were concerned, as the Declaration of Independence had put out there, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should not be infringed. But if you don't put down on paper, according to their argument, if you don't put down on paper what those rights and freedoms are, then they can be violated by a government that takes it too far and turns tyrannical. Now, the Federalists' argument, the Federalists being people like Madison, Hamilton, John Jay, the people that wrote the Federalist Papers, those three that wrote the Federalist Papers, and the rest of them all kind of felt like if you run the government correctly, that you don't really need those rights written down, that the government will kind of take care of itself, that there's enough checks and balances, there's enough separation of powers to where the natural rights of the citizens would not be infringed upon. So that's the basic argument between the two schools of thought. Now, the high irony is the guy that's going to write the Bill of Rights is James Madison. Madison, who wrote some of the Federalist Papers, who had talked about faction in Federalist 10 as being something that the government would be able to, under the Constitution, take care of, and that, quite honestly, the natural rights should not be infringed upon. Madison kind of points out that, the government should take care of that, yet he's the one that kind of concedes the fact that you need to write some amendments. And so he writes out 12, 10 of which are ratified and added to the Constitution, becoming our Bill of Rights. Now, ever since 1791, when those 10 amendments were added to the United States Constitution, we have only amended the Constitution 17 other times, and they come in spurts. So I'm going to talk about those today, not just the Bill of Rights, but the other amendments that we've added on throughout the 225 plus years since the Constitution was ratified. So we're going to start off again with the basic rights. Amendment 1, which is a pretty loaded one. It's one that, of course, most Americans know, can throw out there pretty readily, but we need to understand exactly what this means. It starts off with the freedom of speech, and as Norman Rockwell very famously depicted in his portrait here during World War II, that this is a freedom, and it's one of the 4 freedoms that FDR talked about. Freedom of speech is protected by Amendment 1. And if you kind of look at this general depiction here, you've got a man standing up in a crowded area, could be pretty much anywhere. Could be in a church, could be in a schoolhouse, could be in a town hall meeting. You've got guys that are dressed in suits. You've got an elderly gentleman sitting behind who's looking up to this man who is plainly clothed, looks like kind of like he's a working man, somebody that just got off shift. And the idea is it doesn't matter what age you are, it doesn't matter what profession you have, doesn't matter who you are, you can still stand up amongst the people and express yourself. And that is guaranteed by the First Amendment. Now, the understanding needs to be made here that this, we call it freedom of speech, but in reality it's freedom of expression. So your body language, what you produce musically, what you produce in videos, and any of those things, media in general, is protected under the First Amendment as well. We're talking about the exercise of expression, which can be speech, but it can be so much more than that. And we'll kind of talk about that as we go through your civil liberties. Amendment 1 also has your free exercise of religion. It also has the establishment of religion in it. Basically what they're saying is doesn't matter what your religion is, you have the right to practice your religion within the United States without infringement by the government. And this is the idea that you can establish a church, a synagogue, a mosque. You can establish whatever it is. You can even establish a kind of out there church, a church that, maybe you have your own religious beliefs, or you choose not to follow a specific religious dogma, you have every right within the United States to establish that and to exercise it freely. That's kind of what they're talking about when they're talking about not only establishment but free exercise. And so, pictures like this where you've got a Jewish rabbi who is talking with the Pope and kind of embracing and talking and getting along, that's kind of what they had envisioned here. And of course, this gets very controversial. Again, we'll talk about that this year. But the free exercise clause is pretty standard as a right. And of course, Amendment 1's extended to the press. The press, of course, meaning the media, whether it be newspapers. And of course, back in the time of the Constitution, it would have been a newspaper that they were talking about. But it extends now to radio, TV, and even on the internet. And there are questions now as to how far this needs to go. Because again, social media, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news at all, there have been questions about how far the social media landscape can go. Can Twitter come around and shut down a page on their site that they feel is misleading when that page is saying, hey, we're a media outlet? What are the limitations? And we'll, of course, talk about that when we hit our civil liberties unit as well. It continues to petition, the idea that you can write out your grievance, have other people sign off on it, and send it to the government that way. Some of you have maybe received petitions through websites like change.org. That's kind of the same basic concept, and there was even a time period on the White House website that you could start a petition and submit it directly to the president, getting online signatures from people in the process. Okay? And finally, freedom of assembly, the idea that you can get together as a group to protest. You can protest whatever you want. Of course, over the summer we had plenty of that, whether it be people who were protesting the shutdown orders by governors within certain states, one of the more famous ones being up in Michigan, or whether or not you have the Black Lives Matter protest movements. Even if you want to qualify, anybody supporting a candidate. So, the Trump rally where people were all on I-275 kind of driving and kind of clustering together to show their support of a political candidate. They have every right to gather like that under the First Amendment. Now, can things go a little awry? Sure, you might have some issues. Of course, over the summer, Black Lives Matter would have a protest, and there may be people who show up to that rally and cause mass chaos, cause carnage, go out and set fire to things. Those people are not protected under the First Amendment. If the police were to come in and arrest those people, which has happened, of course, Louisville, unfortunately, has had a lot of issues over the past couple of weeks. Seattle has had some issues, Portland, Oregon. There's been some areas of the United States that have had some serious issues with protests and protesters possibly going too far. So we'll kind of talk about that during the Civil Liberties Unit as well, about what the limits are to assembling together in order to protest something, okay? But that's Amendment 1. Amendment 2. Amendment 2 is the right to bear arms, okay? Now, of course, the right to bear arms, this is a very complex, very controversial amendment merely because it depends on how people read it. There are some that read it, hey, militia, that's what they intended, so therefore if you're a member of the militia, you have the right to bear arms, but other than that, you might be limited. Other people read it as you have the right to bear arms, there is no restriction, the government cannot stop you from having a weapon. Okay? And of course, there's all manner of people falling in the middle of this, and this has become exceptionally controversial in this day and age of, unfortunately, mass shootings and other issues that pertain to the gun. You're going to have groups like the NRA that are very militant in their pursuit of protecting this right, which again is what they feel is their right under the Constitution and under Amendment 2. But then you also have possibly groups like a parent group like Newtown Public Schools up in Connecticut, which have started all kinds of groups. There's also Stoneman Douglas down in Florida, where there have been student and parent groups that have formed to fight against the right to bear arms and to limit the right to bear arms. And again, we'll talk about this when we hit our Civil Liberties Unit, but the amendment is pretty vague in their interpretation, or pretty vague in their wording, so the interpretation, I should say, is kind of up to the person, and this is why the Supreme Court matters so much in cases that revolve around some of these amendments, because the amendments may not be as explicit in their writing, okay? And you have some people out there that'll put memes out there and say, well, the founders intended this pretty clearly, but again, it's how you read it. And this is why it matters and why people are fighting so much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's position, now that she's passed away, on the Supreme Court so much, is that the Democrats really wanted to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg with somebody who was very similar in her judicial philosophy. And the Republicans, of course, with Donald Trump's nominee that has come down this weekend, they're kind of figuring they're going to shift that over to a more conservative or a more strict interpretation of what the Constitution really means. Again, it's all up to interpretation. We'll talk about this way more down the line, but interpretation does matter when it comes to amendments like this. Amendment 3 we don't use as much. Amendment 3 used to be a big deal way back during the time of the American Revolution. It's basically saying that there will be no quartering of soldiers inside the United States. Now, quartering means that you are housing them, that the soldiers show up in your community and they come into your house and they can take over your house. They have the right to take over and eat your food and sleep in your house and basically kick you out. This happens in American history a few times, most notably during the Civil War. But again, you have a right under the Constitution to basically say no. So if a contingent of Marines show up at your house and say, hey, we're hungry, we need a place to sleep, you have the right to say, not here. Okay, so under the Constitution, they made that very clear that that was not going to happen in the American Republic. Okay, and again, there have been times where there's been gray area about this, but not as recent. So, you know, this has not been a recent issue. It's very much a 1800s type issue more than it is today. Amendment 4, some people are very intrigued by this. This is the idea of no illegal search and seizure. The idea here is that the police cannot come into your home or search your car without a level of probable cause, as it's known, or a warrant. Okay, it just depends on the situation. And we'll go more in depth in this later on during the Civil Liberties Unit, but again, this is a guarantee under the Constitution that people in law enforcement cannot just come into your private property and just poke their nose around without at least a warrant from a judge, signed by a judge, or probable cause with which to do so. And we'll define that a little bit more later on, but again, this is kind of where you're getting a lot of current issues when it comes to drug enforcement. This, of course, was very much in the news with no-knock warrants. This no-knock raid that happened down in Louisville that unfortunately resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor. That's certainly going to be a court case down the line of whether or not Louisville had the right, the Louisville Police Department had the right to do these things. Is that proper police procedure, especially under the Fourth Amendment? That'll be kind of where they're basically coming from, and they'll also be linking that to the Fifth Amendment, which is a very loaded amendment, but they're going to go along and link that to the Due Process Clause. The Due Process Clause within the Fifth Amendment says that when you are arrested or accused of a crime, that there's kind of a step-by-step procedure you're going to go through. That there's a playbook in order of what to expect, that when you're arrested and taken in, you're going to be processed, you're going to be up in front of a judge, you're going to be officially charged with something, you're going to be given the rights and freedoms of a jury trial, which will be linked to Amendment 6 as well. So there is a process involved in this. Nothing's going to surprise you out of that. Okay? Now, of course, once you go through the process, you're going to have to send everything to the grand jury. So if they accuse you of something, you have to go to a grand jury. The grand jury has to decide whether or not there's enough to prosecute. Is there enough evidence with which to prosecute this person who's accused? If they decide there is not, and this is what happened in Breonna Taylor's case down in Louisville, if the grand jury looks at the evidence and says there's just not enough here to officially charge somebody, then they basically are done with this process. And that's kind of the whole point of why people were so upset and why Breonna Taylor's family's lawyer is now asking for the documents pertaining to the grand jury. Because they want to know what was presented to the grand jury. They want to see what the grand jury said about it so that they can go back and decide where to move forward with this and whether or not protests are going to get anything done in the long run here, and whether or not they need to change the law for that matter down in Kentucky. Kentucky's going through quite a bit because of this very public and very, very controversial situation down there. Amendment 5 also says that you have the right to not incriminate yourself, that if you're on trial and somebody asks you questions, you have the right to plead the fifth, as it's called. You may have seen this in TV shows, movies. Certainly if you ever watched Law and Order, this may come up where somebody says, I plead the fifth, I'll take the fifth on that, whatever else. One of the most notable people to take the fifth was O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson took the fifth by not ever taking the stand in his defense in his murder trial back during the 1990s. He very famously did not take the stand, and by not taking the stand, that is the ultimate form of pleading the fifth, that you're not even going to subject yourself to any sort of questioning by attorneys. Now, some people say, well, doesn't that make you look guilty when you say I plead the fifth, or not even taking the stand? Well, no, because the jury can't come back and say, well, we were going to say not guilty, but then he didn't take the stand, so he just looked guilty. That's not okay. The judge can actually rule a mistrial at that point, because you cannot base your judgment, your rendering on that absence of answering a question. And here's the other point that I'll definitely, if we were in person, I'd make. If we were in person, I'd be pointing to a student and saying, let's say student A, let's say Karen is accused of a crime, okay? Sally, her friend, is called to be a character witness, let's say, and so when they're cross-examining Sally about Karen's whereabouts that night, what happens if Karen's accused of, let's say, a murder, and Sally is the witness that can attest to the alibi that Karen was actually not in town at that point, that she wasn't even in Cincinnati, she was in Cleveland. So Sally is saying, yep, we were in Cleveland at my uncle's house. Okay, we were hanging out at my uncle's house up in Cleveland. And the cross-examination, the prosecuting attorney looks at them and says, all right, fine, what were you doing up in Cleveland? What were you doing at your uncle's house? Well, what happens if they were smoking a bunch of pot and they were helping their uncle, who's a drug dealer, separate the stash so that he could sell it? If she was to say, well, we were doing this, this, and this, she would be incriminating herself and her uncle, and Karen for that matter, in a drug-related crime. Now, that's not what's on trial. Karen is on trial for murder in Cincinnati, not the drug stuff up in Cleveland. So Sally would have the right to say, I plead the fifth. Now, why? It's just not answering the question, okay? Now, again, if that hurts their alibi, if that hurts their storyline, then Karen's got to deal with that, and the defense attorney would have the right to come back, cross-examine, and try and find a way to establish a little bit easier that, hey, where did you eat in Cleveland? Let's say they went out to McDonald's, and I went out to McDonald's, and I have the receipt with the timestamp. Okay, here's Exhibit A now. Like that establishes the alibi. Again, the whole idea is that you're not incriminating, because Sally should not have to admit on the stand that she was violating some other law in order to help her friend about a case that is unrelated and a case that is wrong against her friend. So that's the whole point, that you don't have to incriminate yourself if you're called to the stand. And again, if you're subpoenaed to be a witness in a case, you can't just ignore it. You can't just say, well, I'm not going up there. You can't just say, I'm not doing it. You've got to report. That's part of it. If you get a summons, you can't ignore it. You've got to go to court that day. But you can go up on the stand, take the oath, and just plead the fifth all the way through if you feel like, hey, I don't really want to talk about this stuff, or I don't feel the need to talk about this stuff. You have that right under the Constitution. And finally, no double jeopardy. This idea that, we mentioned O.J. before. O.J. was declared not guilty of murdering his ex-wife and his ex-wife's friend, probably boyfriend, back during the 90s. When the jury came back and gave a not guilty verdict, that meant that he can never be charged with those two murders ever again. Okay? Now, this is where some people really get confused about this with double jeopardy. Oh, he can't get charged with murder. Well, if he goes out and shoots somebody else, if he kills somebody else, then yeah, he can be charged with that murder. What we're talking about is that specific instance of murder. Now, O.J. Simpson very famously was still held accountable in civil trial. That the family of Goldman, I can't remember his first name, Robert Goldman I think was his first name, the family of the person that he was accused of killing sued, and he was held liable or responsible for those killings, so he had to pay money to the family. Okay, and this is very similar to what is happening right now with Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor, of course, in a criminal court case, the three officers were not charged with murder. One was charged with, of course, wanton endangerment, but none of them were hit with murder. Yet the city of Louisville, in a civil court and we'll kind of talk about that here in a second, civil court had to give money to the family for wrongful death. So they still had to admit that Breonna Taylor's death was an accident and unfortunate, and they are held responsible financially for it. But yet, this is what caused a lot of the civil unrest, is none of them were held criminally responsible. So there's a difference between criminal and civil trials. This is all right here, criminal trials. Now, of course, down here, eminent domain, this is one of the least known things. This is the idea that the government can take your property when it's part of a governmental function, but they have to give you basically fair market value. So for example, let's say they decide that Pippin Road has to be widened because they need a turn lane, or because they want to make it a 2-lane road, a 4-lane highway, I should say. They can go to all the people that live up and down Pippin and say, hey, we are plowing up your front yard. Your front yard is going from being, 30 feet to being 15 feet worth of grass, because we've got to take that territory for the new road we're building. Now, what do they have to do? They have to give you money for the land they're taking. But fair market value may not really help all that much. It may be well below what you may get for it, and it certainly is going to affect your resale value if you went from, maybe a half acre of yard to being well below a half acre of yard because of what they took. So again, eminent domain can be very, very controversial. And when we talk about this a little bit more later and go a little bit more in depth, we'll talk about how this can happen very controversially, and has happened controversially here in Cincinnati. Now, of course, Amendment 6, as I mentioned before, O.J. Simpson, very famous, and the reason I keep bringing it up, it's the most famous trial from the past few decades, if you will. This really does kind of go through the idea that you have a right to trial by jury. Okay, so a jury of O.J. Simpson's peers were brought together to assess whether or not he did what he was accused of. And it has to be, in a capital trial like murder, it has to be a unanimous decision. It can't just be, well, 7 said yes and 5 said no, good enough. It's gotta be unanimous. So when they say you have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, that's what they mean. That it has to be very clear, and the jury has to agree with it. Okay, they get the right to confront witnesses, which is very controversial. Okay, not necessarily in murder trials all the time, but it is very controversial in the instance of rape. If you accuse somebody of rape, if they have the right under this amendment to confront the witnesses, they have to be in the courtroom. They have to face them in the court. This is not always easy, especially when you're talking about a crime of passion and a crime of violence like rape. There's a lot of mental anguish that goes along with that, and so a victim having to go in and look at their accused rapist a lot of times has led to some of these rape charges being dropped because they couldn't walk into the courtroom and face them. And again, it's because if you're accused of it, you have the right to look at the person accusing you, and you have the right to confront the people who are saying you did whatever it is you're accused of doing. So this can get controversial, and it has been brought up as to whether or not there are other ways to do this other than actually physically having you both in the courtroom staring at each other basically during the proceedings. And of course, right to counsel, the idea that you have the right to an attorney. You have the right to somebody standing up for you and representing you, and who knows the courts, who knows the process, knows the law, and can help to prosecute your case and defend you in a courtroom. Now, Amendment 7 has to do with civil trials, and we talked about this here a second ago, that criminal cases are the idea that we're deciding whether or not you're guilty or you're innocent. In this one, we're deciding whether or not you did something wrong and you have to pay for it. Okay, we're talking about divorce courts. We're talking about I bought a house and you knew there were problems with the roof, you knew there were problems with the basement, and you sold it to me, and even though I asked these things and I had I went on an inspection and everything, because you knew about it, could I sue you for it? That's kind of where we're talking about civil cases, okay? And of course, the reason I put on Judge Judy and Judge Joe Brown is those courtroom shows, as much as they're very low level, they are civil trials. They are people saying, hey, I was wronged here by somebody else who sold me a lemon car. They sold me some car that doesn't work, and I want my money back. Or, they moved into my apartment and they stole a bunch of stuff, and then they left town, you have the right to sue people, and of course, according to Amendment 7, you have the right to sue for anything over $20. You would never sue for like 50 bucks. You would never do that because the court costs alone would be way more than that. So most of the time you're suing over things like, hey, this car that you sold me wasn't right. I gave you $10,000. The car wasn't good. I want my money back. The person wouldn't give your money back. You sue them in open court to at least get some of that money back. Okay, but again, court fees alone are going to be pretty high, so it's going to be in the thousands of dollars if you're actually going to sue somebody. So if somebody comes by and you're putting on your backpack and they tear your backpack off and it's oh man, that backpack was $25. I'm going to sue. No, you wouldn't. Okay, not over that. But if it's something major, it's a major purchase, you may under the 7th Amendment. 8th Amendment is no cruel or unusual punishment. It's the idea that if you are accused of a crime, we're not just going to kill you. We're not just going to do horrible things to you. But there are certain levels of expectations. So this is also brought up when it comes to the death penalty, whether it be the electric chair, whether it be lethal injection. Some states have had hanging. Some states have had firing squads. There are a multitude of different ways that they have done this in the past. They've all pretty much now standardized where lethal injection is kind of the way to go, but this still has its issues too, because the state of Oklahoma a few years ago tried to do a lethal injection, did it wrong, and the person's arm, instead of it going into their veins directly, it went all into their muscle tissue in their arm, and it eventually killed them, but it was very, very painful. So a lot of people were kind of saying, well, is this the most ethical way of doing this, or should we be doing this? And we'll kind of talk about the death penalty more in depth, but this gets very controversial when it comes to no cruel or unusual punishment, because there are those out there saying the death penalty is cruel and unusual. We shouldn't be doing it. Other people are saying, hey, if these are murderers and they've committed this crime, then eye for an eye is kind of what was downright biblical, if you will, and that's what we're going to do. So the argument can go both ways. It depends on how you read Amendment 8, okay? And Amendment 8 also has no excessive bail, no excessive punishments. We'll get into the details of that later. Amendments 9 and 10 are the reserved powers, basically, or the reserved rights, if you will. Amendment 9, it says basically, if we don't address it in the Constitution, just assume you have the right. So basically, it's just kind of saying, you know what? We know we're not going to say everything. We're not going to cover everything. So if the government doesn't say anything, the states don't say anything, just assume you have the right. It's a very vague, very blanket amendment that has been used for all manner of things, okay? In the early stages of fighting for LGBTQ plus rights, especially the right to marry, Amendment 9 was the one that they were kind of going after, saying, hey, if a state didn't say that marriage was between a man and a woman, then we have the right to get married, which is why in the early 2000s so many states started to prosecute laws saying, well, yes, we did actually put a law on the book. That is what we're doing. That's how marriage looks. Ohio was one of them in 2004. Ohio basically said, hey, marriage is between a man and a woman in the state of Ohio. We actually made it as part of our constitution, okay, our state constitution, to prevent that. But again, Amendment 9 was used by people, seeking rights all the time because they're saying, look, you haven't said anything in the actual law about this. We're just going to assume we have it. Amendment 10 allowed for states to elaborate on the laws, and it basically says, hey, if the national government didn't take a stand on it, then you have the right, which goes right along with my gay marriage example here, where the national government didn't say anything, whereas Massachusetts says, yes, we're going to allow gay marriage. Ohio said no. So that's where kind of that was in the early 2000s, and in 2015, the national government came along and said, through the Supreme Court ruling in 2015 of Obergefell v. Hodges, when they said that gay marriage was legal, it became nationwide legal, okay? So again, this is kind of where the amendments allow for rights to happen within the individual level and state level. And that's your Bill of Rights. Those were the first 10 that ever happened, okay? Now, if you want to take a break and pause the video right now, I would strongly advise you to do so, and then come back to it. So again, go ahead and take a break, and then come back and hit play again, and we'll go through the other amendments, so 11 through 27. All right, welcome back from your break. Okay, Amendment 11 is where we're going to start off here. And I'm going to try and at least kind of breeze through these so that it's not an hour-long presentation here. Okay. The other amendments here, Amendment 11, this one gets a little dicey, but it does make sense when you think about it. This is basically saying you have the right to sue the government, but you have to ask permission to do it. Okay, so if you want to sue the state of Ohio, you have to ask Ohio if it's okay to sue them. Now, on the surface, immediately a bunch of you are probably saying, why would you do that? That's just ridiculous. But in reality, the reason is if you sued over everything that ticked you off about the government would never get anything done, or they'd always have to hire attorneys. And let's be honest, if the government has to spend money on an attorney, where does the government get their money from? They get it from taxation. So a lot of your money that you spend in taxes would be going to a government to spend on lawyer fees to guard against all these excessive and ridiculous lawsuits. I mean, how many people would sue about the, hey, you can't tax me, I don't like my taxes. And they would sue. And if you didn't have this filter, it would just be constant. Now, of course, if the government really feels like they have violated somebody's rights or really feels like they have screwed up, they are going to allow themselves to be sued. I hate to keep bringing up and beating the same drum here, but Breonna Taylor's family was allowed to sue the city of Louisville, and Louisville basically allowed that to happen because, again, if they denied that, think of how bad the civil unrest would be in that city right now if the city basically said, we're not taking any responsibility, nor are we even going to give you your day in court. So again, they really do want to give you your day in court because sometimes it's the easier option, and even though the city of Louisville had to settle out of court for millions of dollars in that instance, and it doesn't really go away, it's the idea that at least the family felt like they had their say, okay? And of course, criminally, they were let down by the system, but civilly, they were. And again, Amendment 11 says you have the right to sue, but you have to ask permission first. Amendment 12 is a presidential election amendment. This settled an issue that happened back in the election of 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was running against the incumbent John Adams. John Adams, who had won the presidency in 1796, was up for re-election in 1800. He lost to Thomas Jefferson the second time around. Well, Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States. The problem is that they were also voting for the vice president, and the vice president was not linked to anybody. Even though everybody kind of knew that Jefferson was running with Aaron Burr, and that was kind of how it was supposed to be, they were not linked like they are now. Now, if you vote for Donald Trump, you're getting Mike Pence. If you vote for Joe Biden, you're getting Kamala Harris. Like, that's how that works. They're ticketed. They're linked together. But that's because of Amendment 12. When in 1800 that happened, not only did Jefferson get 73 electoral college votes, so did Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr said, well, we tied. We both got 73 votes. And under the Constitution, if the Electoral College doesn't declare a winner, it goes to the House of Representatives. And so the House of Representatives had to come together and sort this all out. And there were a lot of people who didn't like Thomas Jefferson. Luckily, there were more people that didn't like Aaron Burr. And if you take my AP American History class, I go to great pains to show you as to how devious and terrible Aaron Burr is. He's later going to kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. He's going to be accused of treason, and he did it. So, I mean, Burr's not a good guy, but Jefferson gets to take over. And again, it's because of that situation where Jefferson becomes president, Burr becomes vice president because the House of Representatives cleans up the mess. They then realize they have to clean up the systemic mess, I should say. So they clean up the mess through Amendment 12. Amendment 13, 14, and 15 are considered the Civil War amendments. So we go years. We're talking, 40 plus years before the next amendment has to come along. In fact, it's actually more like 60 years before the next amendments come along. 13, 14, and 15. So after the Civil War is fought, they realize the necessity that after we've literally ripped up the map of the United States, where it's North versus South, brother against brother, they realize there has to be a resolution. So during Reconstruction, they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th was the abolition of slavery. This is what took the Emancipation Proclamation that was put into effect in January of 1863 and put it into law. This is where they said within the boundaries of the United States, there will no longer be slavery. Okay, so slavery is outlawed with the 13th Amendment. And this is the amendment that was passed in Congress right before Lincoln is shot and killed. So Lincoln at least gets to see this past the first hurdle in the amendment process. It passes through the houses of Congress and then is kicked out to the states, and the states overwhelmingly ratify it, at least in the North. And the southern states coming back in have to admit the 13th Amendment is now law. That's part of them coming back in during Reconstruction. They also passed the 14th, which basically said we're going to extend all rights of citizenship to the former slaves. So as the slaves are coming in and becoming free, they're also going to be established as citizens of the United States. And the 15th Amendment said, and the extra extension is to make sure that citizens have the right to vote. So African American males got the right to vote. Not females yet. Females were still not allowed to vote within the United States. That comes later. But these bulked together are considered the Civil War Amendments. And these are the first ones to extend rights towards African Americans in American history. 16, 17, 18, and 19, this little group, 16 through 19, are considered the Progressive Era Amendments. For those of you that remember your history class with Posta and history class with Flickinger last year, you'll remember the Progressive Movement. And you'll remember maybe the presidents. The presidents were Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was actually the president at the time of all four of these amendments becoming law. The 16th Amendment basically settled the issue of how the government gets their money flow. They get it through income tax. So income tax is the idea that they are going to put a tax on what you make as a worker. So all the money, and for those of you with a job, you know how this works. You work, let's say, 40 hours, and let's say you make 10 bucks an hour, because I'm bad at math. I'd much rather make it easier on myself. So let's say you're making 10 bucks an hour, you work 40 hours that week. You know full well when you get your check, it's not a check for $400. There's money that was taken out of it. So you open up your check, and of course, it's only $267, and you're like, what the heck? What is this? And of course, you notice they're taking money for Social Security, they're taking it for Medicare, they're taking it for all manner of things, but the biggest one is the income tax on your pay, which is automatically taken out of your check. Now, of course, you get, at this age, you get it back. So enjoy that. Enjoy the idea that that money's kicked back to you, but not everybody gets that kind of kickback. Some people owe money every year. So income tax can be very, very controversial, still is to this day. And of course, that's going to be one of the big themes of the first debate this week when they're talking about taxation. Because one of the charges that Donald Trump is making against Joe Biden is, hey, if he comes in, he's going to raise your taxes. Joe Biden is saying, no, I'm not. I'm going to raise taxes on the top 1% or whatever else. So they're going back and forth about taxation because they know how controversial it is and how much of a hot button issue it is for the electorate. People that vote worry about how much money the government's going to take out of their paycheck. Okay? The direct election of senators, the idea that the people get to elect their senators. You have 2 senators for the state of Ohio. Sherrod Brown, who's a Democrat, Rob Portman, who's a Republican. You're one of those weird states that splits it. But here's the thing. The reason that it's split like that is because you, as a voter, would go in and actually vote for them directly. That was not always the case. Used to be that the state house would actually decide that, so that your state assembly would actually come together and say, hey, who should we send to the Senate? Well, of course, if the Republicans or the Democrats were the majority, then they're just sending senators from that political party. So if let's say in Ohio the Republicans control the state house, they would be sending 2 Republicans to the Senate. And is that really the correct viewpoint, I guess, of the state at that point? And are they really representing you, or are they representing the party, or are they representing a moneyed interest or something like that? So the idea of this reform was to give you, the voter, the chance to select your own representatives within the Senate. Okay, just the same way you decide your representatives to Congress. 18th Amendment was no alcohol, prohibition. So this was the idea that they were banning the sale, the production, the transportation, everything of alcohol. Alcohol was banned under the 18th Amendment. Easiest way to remember that is at the age of 18, you are an adult inside the United States, but you cannot drink legally. Okay, so no alcohol at 18. Okay, 19, right to vote for women. Okay, that was the big one. That's, of course, what we're celebrating this year. It's been 100 years since women got the right to vote. 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. Women's suffrage, and that's a key word to make sure we understand it. Suffrage means the right to vote. So anytime you hear suffrage, especially if we have an air test this year, they love to throw the word suffrage, S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E. Okay, suffrage means the right to vote. Okay, and in this case, we're talking about it for women. women get the right to vote. They vote for the first time in the election of 1920 and elect Warren G. Harding as their first president, if you will, from the women's right. Really, women as a voting bloc do not become an issue in presidential politics until 1960. So it takes them about 40 years to really start voting as a bloc separate from their husbands. Okay, and that was the election that was Richard Nixon, where most men voted for Richard Nixon, but most women voted for John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy ended up becoming president of the United States because of that shift where some women did not vote with their husbands. Okay, needless to say, those are all considered the progressive amendments, 16 through 19. The 20th is your next presidential amendment. It is the lame duck amendment. This is the one that basically shortened the time span between the election and Inauguration Day. Inauguration Day used to be March 4th. They realized that, hey, you know what, because of transportation, because of communication improvements and everything, we really don't need that long period. So for example, on November 3rd, we're going to vote for the president. Now, let's say they vote for Joe Biden. Let's say Joe Biden wins the election. That would mean that Donald Trump knows he's not going to be the president anymore from that election day all the way to the time he takes the oath of office. Now, some people even to this day say that's still too long because the Inauguration Day is now, because of this amendment, January 20th. And the easiest, again, remember 20th Amendment, January 20th, it's the same numeric value, if you will. But bottom line is, from November 3rd to January 20th, Donald Trump is considered a lame duck. He is no longer going to be president on January 20th. You know, we know that's going to happen. That's how the Constitution is written. There will be a transfer of power over to Joe Biden. Joe Biden takes the oath of office. He becomes the next president, the 46th president of the United States, and Donald Trump leaves. Now, if that happens, if that's how this all plays out, Trump would be a lame duck for about 2 months and some change. During that time period, is he really going to be followed by the members of Congress? Is he going to be able to push through a lot of legislation? Probably not. You know, he's probably going to be ignored during that time period, and there's concern that, hey, that's a long time of having somebody who's just not really in power because everybody's looking forward to the next president. Okay, and this has even happened before the election because if you remember, Barack Obama, for the last year of his presidency, had a Supreme Court vacancy that they just kind of left open because he was not going to be president because of a term limit. Okay, so, and we'll get to that here in a second. So again, the lame duck amendment, even to this day, is a little controversial because there are some people that think we should shorten it even more. Okay, but again, March 4th used to be the old Inauguration Day. Think about that if we went from November all the way to March having a lame duck. That would be a very long time. So they did shorten that, but again, some people are saying because of the newer advancements, like Joe Biden could hop on a plane, be in D.C. that same night or the next morning to take over power. So there are some people saying, hey, shouldn't we shorten this even more? Really what that lame duck period allows them to do is to nominate people, to get their cabinet in place, to do all the things they need to do in the transition of power. So there is a purpose to it, but if we're just talking about individuals from Trump to Biden, there are a lot of people saying, well, we could just merge and be done with it. So again, this can be a little controversial down the line. The 21st Amendment, the repeal of prohibition. We realized, if you remember from your history classes, that the taking of alcohol away from the American people didn't really work out. It was an instance where people really kind of got upset about this. And of course, we had more problems because of it. We got rid of one problem and got a whole host of others. So we got gangsters like Al Capone. We got people open up speakeasies. We had all kinds of gang activity, all kinds of illegal activity that it was related to the drinking. And so by 1933, we were in the throes of the Great Depression, and FDR and Congress basically said, hey, you know what, this didn't work, so we're going to get rid of it. And so they repealed it, which means they canceled it out. They basically took an amendment that they put in, said, nope, we made a mistake, and pulled it right back out, okay? It's the only time we've ever done that. So the 18th Amendment took away alcohol, 21st Amendment put it back in. Now, the easiest way, again, to remember it, 18, no alcohol, 21, yes, you can, okay? So that's kind of how I remember it. Just kind of throwing it out there that, at the age of 21, you can drink legally, so the repeal of prohibition would have supplied alcohol at that point. 22nd Amendment, I just kind of mentioned this, was the limit of presidential terms. Now you are limited, like I referenced with Obama, he was limited to 2 terms. Now this is coming off of FDR's dying in office after being elected to a 4th term. A lot of people said, you know what, not only was it too much stress on FDR back during the time of the Great Depression and World War II, they also kind of realized he got a little too powerful. So they put into place the limitation of 2 terms, 2 full terms. So if I'm Donald Trump and I win the next election cycle, he's done after that. Now, of course, he's put out there that, because he had so many problems in his first term and because, the Democrats and the media and whatever else have done this, that, or the other, that I should get a 3rd term. No matter what he says, that's not going to happen because the 22nd Amendment is pretty clear. Trust me on this one, you're too young, but if any president would have figured out how to get a 3rd term, it would have been Bill Clinton. The guy was really, really upset that he had to leave after 2 terms. So for those of you that are kind of listening to all those conspiracy theories that, if Donald Trump wins the 2nd term, he'll try for a 3rd, he can't, not under the current Constitution. So 2 full terms as president, you're allowed 8 years if you're elected to 2 terms. But they have this caveat of 10 years, okay? So let's say Donald Trump wins re-election and he gets so excited after his first State of the Union address, after he takes the oath of office. He takes the oath of office, gets into the 2nd term, gives his State of the Union address, gets so excited that he has a heart attack and dies, okay? Mike Pence would take over for the remainder of that term because he's vice president. Now, because Mike Pence would have been president for 3 years and some change, he would only be allowed under this amendment to run for 1 more term, okay? Now, what happens if that excitement and everything happens in the last year? Let's say Donald Trump is in year 7.5 of his presidency. And let's not be so morbid this time. I don't want to cause death to anybody here. Let's say Donald Trump says, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with people yelling. I'm done with people complaining. I'm just resigning. And he becomes the 2nd president in American history to just say, I resign. So he resigns 7.5 years into his presidency. Mike Pence takes over for that last half year. He runs for election. He gets elected. Then he runs for re-election, gets re-elected. He's allowed to go for 8+ years because he is allowed under that 10-year limit to keep going, okay? Now this, again, only once has this even come close to even being an occurrence. Lyndon Baines Johnson could have run for re-election in 1968. He chose not to, okay? So that was the only time we ever had where that legitimately could have happened. It did not happen because Johnson decided to walk away, which ended up being fortuitous because Johnson had a bad heart. He had heart conditions, and he ended up dying 3 years later anyway. So had he won re-election in 1968, he would have died in office. At least that's kind of how it looks, and it would have been a problem after that anyway. But again, this is where they get the 2 full terms or 10 years total. 23rd Amendment allowed for electors for the District of Columbia. We talked about this when I talked about the Electoral College. The Electoral College basically gives point values to every state. DC was voting, but all their votes were just being dumped into the popular vote. It was not actually being counted as one of the Electoral College. It was not a part of the Electoral College. So DC said, hey, we're voting, but it doesn't count for anything. And that's when the Electoral College was added on, the 3 extra Electoral College votes. That's why in the Electoral College it's 100 Senate positions, 435 House of Representative positions, meaning you have 535 votes in the Electoral College from the states. DC gets the other 3, so it's 535 plus 3. That makes 538. And of course, half of that is 269. 269 plus 1 is 270, and that's why in the Electoral College they say you need 270 Electoral College votes to win. So on November 3rd, when they're going through all the different states and how they voted and color coding them red or blue, when one of those candidates, Trump or Biden, gets 270 or more Electoral College votes, they are the next president of the United States. That's how it works. And it doesn't matter about the popular vote. Remember, we talked about that. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more popular votes. Doesn't matter, because under our Electoral College system in the Constitution, the Electoral College vote is the one that matters. So when Donald Trump got 306 Electoral College votes because he managed to swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania towards his column, when that occurred, he became the President of the United States, okay? Again, 24th Amendment, abolition of the poll tax. This was another civil right issue. where, yes, African Americans had been given the right to vote under the 15th Amendment, but were being denied in the South during the 1960s through things like poll taxes, literacy tests. If you remember from your American history classes, this probably would have been when we were on quarantine last year, so you may not remember this as well. But that was occurring where they were basically charging money to vote. They made that illegal under the 24th Amendment. That is now illegal. You cannot do this. Now, the poll tax debate has been brought up again because one of the things that is new out there is a big push for state IDs, that you have to show identification, excuse me, show identification to vote in certain states, okay? So you actually have to have a driver's license or passport or something like that. So there are a lot of people out there that says, well, yeah, that makes sense. Shouldn't you have to prove you are who you are to vote? Well, there are some caveats to that where it's going to be an issue, and we'll kind of talk about that throughout the year. But let's say what happened, my grandfather, when he was alive, my grandfather gave up his car when he was 90 years old. So when he needed to renew his driver's license, he didn't do it because he didn't have a car. So at the age of 96, when he was voting in the election of 2016, he was very upset because Pennsylvania had passed a law where you had to have an identification card. That's where he lived. So my father and I drove out to see him, and we said, hey, what do you want to do on this trip? And he was like, I need to go get my driver's license. So part of his vacation with us was going to the DMV and at least getting not his driver's license, but an identification card so he could vote. Now, it's no big deal for him. Poppy was fine with it. He spent the money on it. But we kind of had a discussion, like, it's interesting because what happens if somebody is in financial straits, somebody who is maybe paycheck to paycheck, especially an elderly person who's on maybe their Social Security payments, maybe they don't have enough money to purchase an ID card. Wouldn't that also constitute a poll tax in a way? It'd be an indirect poll tax. So again, that's going to be challenged in the courts for years to come, but for those of you saying, well, that seems like it's pretty cut and dry, all of these amendments can be challenged in some way, shape, or form. They're all controversial in some way because of that. And just to kind of link it, is this one controversial? Not for D.C., but what about Puerto Rico? What about Guam? They're territories that vote in elections, but they don't have electoral college votes. So there's all manner of complaints across the board, and all of these amendments are very controversial on the whole. Okay? 25th is presidential disability and secession. We were going to talk about this at length. What happens if the president cannot do their job? What happens if somebody has a stroke, a heart attack? What happens if it's something as simple as, hey, I think it was Jimmy Carter had hemorrhoids. Okay, he had to have a minor surgery to take care of that. He had to sign off and say, hey, if anything goes wrong, go ahead and put my vice president in, during my disability. This happened during Ronald Reagan's time in office. He was shot. There was an attempt at an assassination. When he was shot and he was in surgery, George H.W. Bush, who was his vice president, was technically serving as president during that time period. Now, all of that is under presidential disability, but secession goes even farther. Secession is the idea that everybody knows that, hey, the president can't do the job, the vice president takes over. Well, what happens if both of them, what happens if Donald Trump and Mike Pence are on the same plane and it goes missing? Well, then who takes over? Now, of course, the nightmare scenario for the Republicans at that point is the next person in line is Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House, and she's a Democrat. Certainly is not a fan of Donald Trump very much, and of course the Republicans are not a fan of her, so that's where it gets highly contentious and controversial. Underneath that is the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then it continues going from there. It goes through the presidential cabinet, and then it goes through a whole host of other things. I mean, there is a clear-cut and defined line of secession, if you will. You can look it up online where they're giving you step by step all the way down that if all of these people are incapacitated, if all these people are removed from office, whatever the case may be, here's the next person in line. There used to be a show on TV called Designated Survivor, and it was all based on this scenario. Okay, 26th Amendment, right to vote, another suffrage amendment against suffrage, right to vote. They lowered the voting age to 18. Again, in your history classes, they would have taken great pains to go through this and talk about the Vietnam conflict. Again, you guys were on quarantine last year, so the idea behind this, in case you missed it, was that if I can be drafted into the military and forced to go fight in a conflict, why can't I vote? Okay, and that was where this big push to make the voting age 18 came from. So when Ficker and I are really kind of getting on you about, hey, when you turn 18, you should register to vote, we're literally talking about something that has been fought over, quite literally has been fought over throughout the American history. It was your right to vote at 18, okay? And the 26th Amendment allowed that for that to happen. And especially for those of you that are concerned about the state of the world and everything like that, you really should be registering to vote so that you can choose your leadership. Because again, if you forfeit that right, if you just don't use it, you really have no right to complain. And the final amendment, the very final one, the last one, is the 27th. Now this is the most recent one, of course. It happened in 1992. In 1992, there was a problem with congressional pay where Congress was voting themselves pay raises. And of course, any American would love that. If you have a job, you would love the idea of walking into your job and saying, man, I worked hard last week. I deserve a pay increase. I deserve more money. And just getting that pay increase, voting for it, all those on the Fry Guy line who want $1 per hour raise, say aye, aye, and then you all get more money. That's of course not how it works, but Congress could technically do it that way. Well, what the Congressional Pay Limitation Amendment did is they still have the right to do that. They can still write it as part of the bill that Congress gets $2,000 more per year. They have the right to do that. The problem is that they do not get it right away. They don't get the pay increase until after their next election cycle. So they literally will have to go back and face the voters. And if the voters say, hey, I noticed you voted yourself a pay increase, what's the deal with that? They've got to answer that question. And if they say, look, it's costing more money, we needed a raise because it's costing a lot of money for me to have a place in D.C. and a place back here in Cincinnati. If that's not good enough and the voters say, hey, you got $130,000 a year, I think that's good enough, they could vote you out for that. So you have to face the voting public under the 27th Amendment in order to get that raise, which causes a double whammy that, let's say you do vote yourself a pay raise, you lose re-election, not only does the person who beats you get your seat in Congress, they also get your pay raise. So again, this is something that tried to limit it, and for the most part it has. I mean, it was kind of out of control there in the 1980s. So in 1992, they kind of put the stop to all that. But again, that's how that amendment process works. But again, if we're talking 1992, it's been a long time since we've had a presidential amendment. You're talking 27 years plus now that we haven't had 28 years plus that we haven't had a constitutional amendment. So to think that we are due for one is pretty accurate. We're probably due for a constitutional amendment. Now, one of the things that Mr. Ficker assigned to you was what would be the 28th Amendment. So you've already had that assignment. I'm going to be assigning that as well to my students this week. So kind of be thinking, my students especially, since you're going to be doing this, this is the general progression of the amendments. This is what the amendments have always been about. So what might fit as the 28th Amendment? Would it be an electoral change? Would it be a representation change? Would it be a change in suffrage voting, the voting rights? What is out there where you think maybe, hey, that would fit in quite nicely as a 28th Amendment? Now, of course, when we assign this, we always get a bunch of kids that are like, oh, legalization of weed. Here's the problem. When we're talking about that, it doesn't really fit, because we always get kids that say, well, you talked about alcohol. Well, that's the thing. They took away alcohol. Alcohol was already an established commodity. They took it away and then had to put it back out. And marijuana was never an established, yep, we've got this as a commodity. We always had it on the market, and now we're just going to take it away. So kind of realize that that's not really where the amendment's going to come from. The amendment's probably going to come from some form of change to our system. It's going to be a change to the Constitution in general. So again, when you're doing that 28th Amendment assignment, really try and think about what are the changes to the government, what are the changes to representation, what are the changes to the rights of citizens, and certainly what are the changes to your voting rights specifically that could possibly be the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. I realize it's been about an hour. My apologies. I don't intend to drone on for that long, but hopefully this answers all the questions necessary for you to complete the assignment and at least give you a head start on completing the other assignments for the amendments. If you have any questions, as always, you can reach out through email to me, to Mr. Ficker. You can certainly attend our office hours. And again, if you need special office hours, you can reach out to us individually, and we can get you a Google Meet link, or we can give you a Zoom link to a meeting where we can meet if you need it to be in the afternoon, if you need it to be in the morning. We realize that my office hours being at noon and his office hours being at 8 a.m. are not always conducive to everybody. So again, if you need those specialized help, please reach out. Have a good week, folks.